Good morning. My name is Sharmone Shaw. It is Wednesday, October 19th. It's about 10:30 a.m. I am a graduate student in Human Services Counseling at Liberty University. I've also obtained my Bachelor of Science degree in Crisis Counseling, and I'm a trained recovery coach. I come before you today to talk about a topic that really touches my heart, and that topic is poverty. The title of my speech for today is A Dry and Thirsty Land. My topic is that intergenerational psychological problems do exist in low income and poor communities. Also, there are barriers, biased values, and belief systems that keep certain races of people bound in the spiral of poverty. As human service workers, we can educate the public to diminish stereotyping, stigmatism, labeling, biased statements, and belief systems, and provide resources and comfort for impoverished individuals and families that have been traumatized by the negative impact of poverty. Human service workers can advocate for individuals and families to obtain necessary resources. We can assist with creating community organization planning to improve communities. We can also provide crisis counseling and peer support to help individuals and families to cope with triggers and stressors and make positive change. We also can make referrals to mental health professionals and practitioners to assist in medical conditions that are out of our scope of practice. As of 2014, the annual salary for a human service professional, depending on your title, can range from $34,000 with a bachelor's degree to $72,000 with the master's degree. So as you could see, the pay is not really the focus here. It's a passion that we have to assist others that's stronger than the pay. The purpose of my speech is to provide hope and restore spiritual and emotional well-being to impoverished communities. My scripture for today is, O God, thou art my God, early will I seek thee, my soul thirsteth for me. My flesh longeth for thee, in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen in the sanctuary. And that comes from Psalm 63, verses 1 through 2. And I will use other scriptures throughout my speech, but that was my main scripture that I'm going to speak about. As I said before, I have taken the necessary courses and training in crisis counseling, recovery coaching, and human services counseling that covers a wide variety of subjects on poverty, substance abuse, gang activity, domestic violence and homelessness, single parenting, and more. I've also had training with different mental health disorders such as depression, PTSD, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and various other diagnoses that are listed in the DSM-4 and DSM-5 statistical manuals. The subject of poverty is passionate to me because many of my family members have struggled with poverty that seems to be related to cultural and intergenerational belief systems that's had a devastating effect, causing hopelessness, defeat, and death, and I wanted to understand why. As a human service and crisis counselor, I hold the view that poverty can strike anyone. Typically, it's been the norm that it only strikes low-income and poor families. But as we could see, lately, it's been striking middle-class families as well. And without support and intervention, the trauma that is experienced can be devastating to individuals, families, and communities. Typically, we mostly think that when a person is struggling with poverty, it is their fault. And at times, it can be. Maybe they mismanage their funds, they're gambling, they have substance abuse problems, or excessive spending. But that's not always the case. The individualistic view of poverty derives from belief systems and values from the 14th and 16th century poor laws of England. During that era, any individual who's living in poverty did not receive any compassion or help, and it was looked upon as it was their fault, and they're not eligible for public aid. During that time as well, public aid was only available for the elderly and pregnant women. If an able-bodied person lives in poverty, didn't make an effort to obtain work, and tried to seek public aid, then they were beaten and put to death. More often than not, circumstantial poverty comes into play for many people, in which situations occur that is out of the control of the individual, such as losing a job a few years prior to retirement. Due to age, when a person has been laid off their job a few years prior to retirement, they may not be able to find another full-time job and may have to resort to part-time work or public aid to survive. But then they struggle and they live in poverty because the money they receive barely covers their basic living expenses. The downside of that is that the elderly face many barriers, such as not being able to receive Social Security and retirement benefits until they reach the age of 65. They may face homelessness because income is not sufficient to pay for current living expenses. When a person is homeless, they're not eligible to receive public aid due to not living at a physical address. The homeless elderly are the most vulnerable population that face violence, financial scams, substance abuse, physical and mental health decline, and eventually death. Other barriers that individuals, families, and communities face are cultural and intergenerational belief systems that are passed down to their children, whom by the age of 7 have already developed the same negative belief systems and values as their parents. Thus, the poverty cycle continues throughout many generations. When I say that, I mean that, okay, we're poor, we're hopeless, there's nothing we could do to change our situation. Many people become accustomed to living in poverty, that even if you brought them out of their poverty state, it would be very difficult for them to adjust to a new environment where there's, sufficient housing. It's a drug-free neighborhood. They become accustomed to living in poor living conditions. It's hard for them to adjust. I mention frequently in this order individuals, families, and communities because in our Western culture, our belief system is that negative situations that affects individual also affects families and communities as a whole. But in other cultures, such as Native American communities, there's no such thing as individual circumstances affects communities. Their culture and belief systems addresses issues only by community efforts. So in order to help communities, we have to understand the culture and belief systems that exist in order to assist them. Social, economic, and racial poverty exists for certain races of people. As of this year, 2016, according to the National Center for Children in Poverty, children under the age of 18 are living in low-income and poor families at a high rate. African Americans and Hispanics are disproportionately living in low-income families. African Americans at 65% or 6.3 million. Hispanics 62% or 10.9 million. Native Americans 62% or 0.3 million. Whites 31% or 11.4 million. And Asians and other races are at 43% or 1.5 million. My theory is that, Asians and other races that live at the lowest poverty rate is because many races of people stick together and they help one another individually, families, and communities. They get together as a whole. And if one person is struggling, they help one another until they get back on their feet. But these situations and many others, such as famine and starving families in foreign countries, is very tragic. Many children and families are starving, just searching for food and water to survive. But oftentimes resources are limited or exhausted, and children and families die from severe starvation. In the United States, though, individuals, families, and communities are starving too, but not as severe. We're struggling in other ways, such as not being able to obtain employment due to limited jobs and community resources, rising housing costs and utilities, and minimum wage jobs that barely covers living expenses.